Yeah, thank you all very much for coming out on a cold night to hear me. And it's definitely with the topic. I know it might be an interesting topic, but it's also a very hard topic. And maybe to give some of my background, if what qualifications do I have to be speaking on something like this? And I really feel like I don't know who would. And in a lot of ways, I honestly don't feel qualified for something like this. Um, I've grown up in Perth, and I've had, I think by most standards, a fairly easy life. I've read things in the news of difficulties and whatnot, but I really don't feel like I've personally had great challenges myself. I might have known people, family who've gone through cancer and the like, or have passed away, but myself, I'm probably yet to face some of that. My general interest is in apologetics, and for me, I grew up in a Christian family, but going to our school, I had virtually no Christian friends. In my immediate group of 20, I was the only one. And it's not like high school kids really attack your faith that much, but there'll be times when they're like, hey, why do you go to church anyway? Didn't you hear in school we learn things like evolution? What do you have to say about that? And so from an early age, I just had an interest in apologetics. I needed to both understand my own faith to say, is it something that made sense to me? Did I have reasons for it? Or, is it something, particularly once I was growing up, I can say that was what my parents believed and move on. And I come to find that there are really good reasons to believe it. And the problem of pain and suffering is probably one of the biggest challenges. And so while I would still say there's still so much to know, I've found the things I've read and learned have been useful, and so hopefully I can share some of that tonight. And so I guess we'll jump into our topic, but before really getting into it, I'd want to begin by saying this is a issue that can be handled in so many ways. There's academic and intellectual sides of it, as well as very much personal and emotional sides of it. And so being a public talk, I can only really approach it from and approach you all and your issues from a distance. And so I really do apologize if, and I would sure there's many people here have gone through difficulties and struggles. And so I don't want this to come across as sterile, although I'm sure it somewhat will. And I would want to say that growing up as a Christian, I've seen the love in the church for people who are hurting, and I know there's been love outside of the church as well, but I just want to say I'm sure that Red Door Community Church, the people and the pastors here would be honored to be able to hear your struggles and do what they can to help carry that load. And I come from Providence Church, and I know I'd say the same thing, if you're on that side of the city, would be honored as well to be able to just be a listening ear, and there may not be much advice we can offer or do, but we'd just want to be able to go alongside you with that. And so we'll try to touch on some of the personal aspects later, but I guess first and foremost, there is an academic issue of this, is can God and suffering go together, and pain and evil? And so we want to sort of address that. And it's pretty puzzling to know where to begin in this. There's just so much that can be said. And so I did look in the news today, and just from news.com.au, some of the articles, I noticed there was issues on racism, there's articles on poverty, there was criminal activities and people in jail and arrested, justice and injustice, there's about sickness, there was death, and there's sexual issues being discussed as well. And so just news articles makes it very relevant and that real that there is these issues going on. And to share, you could pick anything, but just to share a little bit from the Holocaust. If you're familiar with this image up on the screen, so this is where not all would have sadly passed away at this camp, but around 6 million Jews died during the Holocaust, of about the 9 million who were alive at the time in Europe. And here's an account from Eli Wiesel, who was a survivor from one of these concentration camps. And so he says, "Blessed be God's name. Why? But why would I bless him? Every fiber in me rebelled, because he created thousands of children to burn in his mass graves, because he kept 6 crematoria working day and night, including Sabbath and holy days, because in his great might he had created Auschwitz, Birkenau, Burner, and so many other factories of death. My eyes had opened, and I was alone, terribly alone in a world without God and without man." And you just get a glimpse of the sadness and the reality of this. And I think one of the good places to start is to say that evil is real. It's horrible, and it's not something that can just be sort of pushed aside. Related to that, we're going to spend most of my time looking from a Christian perspective, which is what I'm a Christian. But we would need to say, is this a problem just for Christians? And really, every worldview, every religion has to be able to give a response to this. And so you could ask, how do some of the others? And I don't really want to speak on behalf of them, so I'm sort of giving you homework to say, you need to go look up and see what they say. But there are worldviews that would deny the reality of evil and say, this is really just an illusion. At the end of the day, it's not a real thing. And so I don't think, even as a first step, I think that's already sort of wrong-headed. I think we want to affirm that there is horrible things out there that are objectively bad. It's not just that you dislike that, or that some people might find that okay. It's no, this is evil. It's horribly wrong every time, everywhere. And then it cries out, like, why is this happening then, if there is a good and powerful God? To share another sad story from Philip Yancey, who he wrote a book called Where is God When It Hurts 30-odd years ago, and it's become a fairly well-received Christian book on the topic of evil and suffering. But he has revisited this question a couple of years ago in his book called The Question That Never Goes Away. And he writes of one of the letters he'd received since writing the first book, and he says, in one of these letters, I received a 16-year-old girl who had been studying criminal forensic profiling articulated one of the most urgent questions. I've been studying murders. I've learned about their victims, their families, the inconceivable torture that they endured. I'm not talking about martyrs or missionaries who have willingly put their lives on the line for their faith, but rather unsuspecting victims of demented crimes. I believe in a Heavenly Father who loves his children and wishes good for all. And while I do not believe God calls these things to happen to these people, my struggle in my faith is why could he have not helped but intervene? So my question is this. If God did not protect those people and innocent children who were tortured, while some even cried out God to save them, how do I have faith that God will protect me? I want to believe, but I feel like the man in the Bible said to Jesus, I believe, help me with my unbelief. And so there's so many more stories that you could tell. And I guess in that sense, I don't want to be trying to answer a straw man to say, I'm just taking a case of I stubbed my toe or I had to go to the dentist, as painful as that can be. And I want to say, there's serious issues out there and what response can be given to this. And so we just need to clarify a little bit of definition, about so what are we talking about here in terms of evil? And in broad strokes, you can talk about moral evil, and this is basically evil done by the activity of a free agent. So if something like murder, sadly, would fall in a category like that. And then we've also got natural evil then. And this is basically evil that's not resulting from moral agents. So it's things like tornadoes, tsunamis, earthquakes, and the like. And even though we just asked, what is evil or pain and suffering and stuff like this? And so it's actually quite hard to define evil that almost doesn't assume that there's a God as such, which we'll touch on a bit more. But so evil can be said to be a privation or corruption of that which is good. And so it's already assuming that it's like a good standard, there's something there, and this is like a twisted version of it. So pain is related more to, like in your, say, nervous system and senses, something that you feel, and in that sense you can technically have just good physical touch or painful physical touch. And to suffer is really to endure something that's like bad, right? But both pain and suffering then seems to already assume that there's this category of evil, such that if you said, I had to endure eating a really bad meal or something, unless you've got an objective category for badness or evil, you can't really say that it wasn't a good thing to endure, right? Yeah, and so on this note, the question of what is evil to begin with is actually just a very difficult issue. Yeah, so much more can be said, but I'll keep moving on. So if we look at the problem of evil and suffering, it can really be divided up into three things. There's the logical problem, and this is the challenge that you can't have God and evil. It's one or the other. It's a mutually exclusive, logical either-or choice. And then we've also got a evidential challenge that's saying, hey, it's not mutually exclusive, but it's still very unlikely. And then finally, you've got this personal challenge as well. And so if we begin with the logical problem, we're basically asking, can there be God and evil? And as it stands, that doesn't have a logical contradiction. So if I said there is a God and there is no God, or there is evil and there is no evil, then that's a logical contradiction. Though most of us probably feel the force that saying there's God and evil, there's something wrong with that, but just as that stands, there's nothing. And so most of us probably can just sort of connect the dots, but there needs to be another sort of premise. And it could be something like this, that if God were all-powerful and all-loving, he would have no good reason for permitting evil. You could phrase it other ways. So if God's all-powerful, he would be able to stop all evil. If he's all-loving, he would want to stop all evil. And then hence, why is there evil? But it's any sort of objector who's saying, hey, I can't believe in a God because of evil. You'd have to get him, like he's got the burden of proof, if you like, to say what is actually the contradiction, what's the problem with that. And so if we can find a reason that God might have, then would show that there is no logical contradiction. And I do want to highlight that for the logical problem of evil, this doesn't have to be an actual reason. So we don't have to know what God's reason for why allowing it is. For the logical problem, the challenge is that logically speaking, the two can't be. So as long as we can just show a possible reason, it may not be the actual reason, but as long as you can show a possible reason, you would show that there is no logical contradiction, whether or not this is God's reason for allowing it, right? And so in the literature, there's been a few that have been suggested. One is that the purpose of life is not about happiness, but rather it's knowledge of God. 2, that to develop character, and 3, free will. And so we'll briefly look at these. And so when we say, what is the purpose of life? If it was happiness, the idea would be then that if God failed to keep us happy all the time, then he was failing, right? And so if we experience any unhappiness or evil, if you like, then there's something wrong. But on the Christian account, it's not that God is like Santa Claus or like a pet owner trying to make us happy all the time. Rather, the story is that he wants us to know him, to have a relationship with him. And as such, there could be times when, as a loving parent, he might need to discipline. And so unhappiness or evil, if you like, at times is not necessarily in direct contradiction with that. I'm not saying then, he just directly causes evil all the time, but as it stands then, if that's your paradigm of life is about, say, knowing God rather than happiness, it wouldn't, logically speaking, cause a contradiction and say, no, the two can't be. There's more that could be said about this, but I want to focus more on the third option, so moving on. Another reason that's been suggested is that perhaps sort of in reason for allowing evil is to allow us to develop character. And you see this sort of reasoning in passages of scripture. And for instance, in James chapter 1, it says, "My brothers and sisters, consider it nothing but joy when you fall into all sorts of trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its perfect effect, so that you may be perfect and complete, not deficient in anything." And so I know, particularly from a emotional problem of evil, this would just feel like a slap in the face, and you'd be like, that's the worst thing you could have said. And so I guess I apologize if it comes across that way, but right now we're trying to address the logical problem of evil, and it's just to say, if it's necessary for people to grow in character and virtue, and if that comes from having challenges, then that would be a reason why God could allow evil. That's not to say that the reason you're going through difficult things is because you need to grow. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, as the logical problem of evil, if it is true that to help people grow and develop, the presence of evil would allow them to do that, then the two don't stand as a logical contradiction. And so I'm not saying this is God's reason for allowing evil. I'm just saying as long as it's logically possible, that it's true that people would grow in the presence of difficulties, then God and evil as a logical contradiction don't stand. Right? Yeah, and so finally, the main reason that's been sort of popular, particularly in the last 50 years, although this really originates with St. Augustine, who lived in the order of 1600 years ago, is known as the free will defense. And so this is, if God allowed free will, then that might be a reason. And we can first turn to an objector. So J.L. Mackie is an atheist, and he says it's possible that there be a world of free creatures who never go wrong. And 2, if God is all-powerful, he can create any possible world. 3, therefore God can create a world with free creatures who never go wrong. So the thing is, this doesn't work. How does this help? And so the response given by a Christian named Alvin Plantinga goes something like this. And I've just sort of changed the names to make it more theologically interesting. But anyway, he says, let's consider 2 scenarios. If premise A is if Adam was offered a $10,000 bribe, he would accept it. Or premise R, if Adam was offered a bribe, he would reject it. And so now we want to ask, which one is true? And so if God sets up the world such that Adam is offered a bribe, and this doesn't need to be that God's sort of hands reaching down from heaven. He can use me as a corrupt individual and say, hey, I want to get off on some mistake I've done. I'm going to give Adam this. Yep. And so if Adam's free, whether he accepts or rejects it is up to him. So God, being all-powerful, could override that. He could, even though Adam's like, I don't want to take it, God could force him to stretch out his arm and take the money and walk off. So it's not saying that Adam is somehow beyond his control, but if he allows Adam to just freely decide what he's going to do, then it's up to Adam what happens, right? And so you can't freely make someone do something like that. So I've got an older brother who never did this to me, but someone could grab your arm and be like, hey, why are you hitting yourself, stupid? And you're not freely doing that. And so it's the same thing with this. If God overrides someone's free will, they're no longer freely doing it. But if he wants to, he could, because he's still in control, but he could allow them to do that. And so the only difference in these worlds then would be what this free creature does. As such then, if there is free will, you can't guarantee that someone wouldn't make a mistake. It doesn't mean they have to make mistakes all the time. They could make thousands of good choices, or maybe even they as a person you could say could be perfect, but maybe sadly one of their children or later generation makes an evil choice. And so free will would seem to say that God and evil are not necessarily logically impossible to go together. That's the basic claim. There's more that could be said, but yeah. And here's a little video that sort of just summarizes that so far.
The presence of evil, pain, and suffering in our world is the most persistent argument raised against the belief in God.
Bye.
Usually it goes something like this.
Put your hands up now!
An all-knowing God would know evil exists. An all-loving God would want to prevent evil from existing. An all-powerful God could prevent evil from existing. But evil does exist. Now, given that the fourth proposition would appear to be undeniable, it can be inferred that one of the other 3 must be false, and thus there cannot be an all-knowing, all-loving, and all-powerful God. Checkmate. Or at least some people think that. However, not too long ago, an American philosopher named Alvin Carl Plantinga put forth a new proposition that is intended to demonstrate that it is logically possible for such a God to create a world that does contain evil. This is how he summarized his defense. A world containing creatures who are significantly free and freely perform more good than evil actions is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no free creatures at all. Now, God can create free creatures, but he can't cause or determine them to do only what is right. For if he does so, then they aren't significantly free after all. They do not do what is right freely. To create creatures capable of moral good, therefore, he must create creatures capable of moral evil. And he can give these creatures the freedom to perform evil and at the same time prevent them from doing so. C.S. Lewis would agree, saying, "Imagine a wooden beam became soft as grass when it was used as a weapon, and the air refused to obey me if I attempted to set up in it the sound waves that carry lies or insults. But such a world would be one in which wrong actions were impossible, and in which, therefore, freedom of the will would be void. If the principle were carried out to its logical conclusion, evil thoughts would be impossible, for the cerebral matter which we use in thinking would refuse its task when we attempted to frame them." Continuing his defense, Plantinga says, as it turned out, sadly enough, some of the free creatures God created went wrong in the exercise of their freedom. This is the source of moral evil. The fact that free creatures sometimes go wrong, however, counts neither against God's omnipotence nor against his goodness, for he could have forestalled the occurrence of moral evil only by removing the possibility of moral good. So, even though God is all-powerful, it is possible that it was not in his power to create a world containing moral good, but no moral evil. Therefore, there is no logical inconsistency involved when God, although wholly good, creates a world of free creatures who chose to do evil.
Hope that helps us. Just brief recap. So moving on then, so that's the logical problem. So obviously more could be said, but if any of those reasons, such as the purpose of life is knowledge of God, not happiness, that to develop character or free will, are just possible, there may not be actual reasons, then yeah, God and evil wouldn't be logically impossible. But the question could then go, fine, I don't think God and evil are logically impossible, but surely isn't it very unlikely? Just the amount of evil we see, the type of evil we see, that would give you strong reason to doubt that God exists, right? So this is known as the probabilistic or evidential problem of evil. And yeah, so it can be sort of phrased like that. The probability that God exists, given evil, is very low. Yep. And so Alvin Plantinga's respond to this as well. And he says, let's consider this situation. So Alvin Plantinga comes from, I think it's Greenland. And so Phyke is a common boy's name, I take it there. And it says, premise 1, Phyke can swim. 2, Phyke is a Friskin, and 9 out of 10 Friskins cannot swim. So we ask, what's the probability of premise 1 given 2? It's 10%. There's a 1 in 10 chance that Phyke can swim, given that he's a Friskin background and 9 out of 10 Friskins can't swim, right? And so this is like paralleling that. The probability that God exists given evil is 1 in 10 or 1 in a million. It seems very low, right? But Alvin Plantinga then asks, so is there another premise, say 3, that we might know, some other information that might increase the probability, such as Phyke is a Friskin lifeguard and 99 out of 100 Friskin lifeguards can swim. So now the probability of 1 given 2 and 3 is 99%. So premise 3 is still including the premise 2, like, if you like evil or something like this. And so the question would be, is there anything comparable to that? And so he would suggest, yes, there's things like the arguments for God's existence. For instance, when Paul spoke in the last Think lecture, he sort of touched on what's known as the teleological argument, an argument from fine-tuning or design. And so if you think that's a good reason to think that God exists, then perhaps God's existence does become very likely, even given evil. Or other arguments include things like the cosmological argument, the moral argument, or you might think there's evidence from Revelation or from Jesus' resurrection. And so basically, when you can say as a Christian then that, yeah, when I look at the suffering in this world and the evil, it does make me cause to have reason to doubt, and it's something that I question. But that's not the whole story. When I look at everything, all the other evidence, I can still say there's good reason to think God exists, sort of thing. So that's a possible response to this. So that helps. That being said, sorry, skip that. You could respond with sort of a moral argument and say that no, I think evil as such shows that there's objectively bad things, and that's a reason to think that God exists as well. So you don't have to concede 2 is 10% or 1 in a million that God exists on evil. But even if you do concede it, you can still say that God's existence is not unlikely given that. So we're going to skip that video. So a few other sort of objections to this idea of God existing is one's called the evil God objection by Professor Stephen Law. And he basically says that, what if God is not in fact good, but God is evil? And so he allows a bit of nice stuff to happen in this world, really just to set you up for an even greater fall. And so how would we be able to distinguish between whether there's a good God who, because of, say, free will or something, bad stuff's happening, but he's generally, trying to bring about goodness, as opposed to a bad God who's, allowing you to have just enough nice things that you don't despair, but he's ultimately there. So that's the sort of challenge that this objection brings. And there's a few things that you can respond, and one is to say that the sort of the moral arguments, the second point there, is to say that, Christians don't generally argue that such and such a nice thing happened today, or this was nice, therefore God exists. They're making the case for objective morality in general, or objective evil in general, and that's something they would then reason to think that God exists. So if we've got time, we can touch on what the moral argument is, but that's just one point. Another one is to say the Christian story of Jesus' death and resurrection really doesn't seem to fit with that model, because that's saying that God himself, who was meant to be innocent, came into the picture and bore the worst of our sin and guilt, that we might freely sort of be able to go to heaven and escape all this. And so it just really doesn't fit with that evil God paradigm. You might say, though, the evidence for evil is stronger than the case for the resurrection, which you might have reason to doubt that sort of response. But I think there really is good reason, if you look into Jesus' death and resurrection, to believe it happened. That shows that God loves and cares for us. And I think the biggest point, which is not on the handout, is I just, not just personally, there's a whole line of philosophers, but I personally think that the concept of an evil God is a logical contradiction. That is a square circle. And in some way, the first problem, logical problem, asks, saying, if God is all good and all powerful and then evil, so this you could say, well, of course, I have no problems with thinking God exists, because I just think there's an evil God and he brings about evil. So, what's the problem? And so there seems to be some inherent characteristics of God that you can't just get rid of and say, hey, that's still God. So like another way out of the problem of evil, if you like, is to say, well, I don't think God's all powerful. He would like to stop the bad things that happen. He tries his hardest, but some things get past him. And so, you'd say, so there's no problem in me believing evil exists if I believe in sort of a limited God. But I would want to say just that concept of a limited God, or a God who is evil, a God that only loves a little bit, is that just doesn't fit. If God exists, he must be, as philosophers have sort of said, a perfect being. And so in whatever attributes he has, he must have them, like all the good attributes, to a maximal extent. He is, if you like, the greatest conceivable being, or the greatest possible being. And so it wouldn't be good to have a ignorant God as opposed to having an all-knowing God. And so just the notion of an ignorant God just doesn't make sense. It's a non-existent thing. And so basically I would say it's necessary that God is all-powerful, all good, all-knowing, and either he has those things and he exists, or he does not exist and he doesn't have anything. He's not partly knowing or stuff like that. And so that would be my sort of biggest complaint to this. Just the concept of God doesn't imply an evil God. God is by definition good, or he just doesn't exist type of thing. But there are other perspectives on that, as well as most things. Yep. Another sort of objection is, hey, but don't you as Christians believe that in heaven you'll be free? And do you believe that there'll be sin and bad stuff happening? And so if you think it's possible that people can exist in heaven with only happiness and goodness, then why not now? Why not on this earth as well? Why do we have to go through all this? And there's different sort of responses that can be given to this. And one is to say that perhaps for us to have character that's going to be making good choices, you have to go through some difficulties, the sort of that soul-making defense, alluding back to that. The other responses can be things like perhaps God knows the type of people that if they were to be placed in heaven, they would freely choose to do good things and stuff like this. You might be saying this whole free will defense. This is a Molinist response, which I just wish I had time to go into more, but I can't. And sorry, but on the surface, then I just want to say that this doesn't seem to be a challenge either. That sort of defeats the idea of God and evil as being going together. And just for time, I wanted to move on. And so that's pretty much the academic, the logical side of things, this logical and evidential problem. And while I'd want to say it's not like, I think there's this knockdown case by Christians to be able to say, clearly God does exist. I'd want to say the challenge has sort of been met. While they may not have necessarily given an actual reason for why we see all this evil and suffering in the world, they've been able to give possible reasons for why it doesn't show it's impossible, why you don't need to doubt it as such. And, so I'd love to have some questions on that. But just want to turn and spend the remaining of our time looking at, so why is it then that, do we have any actual comfort, any reasons to know rather than these theoretical stuff that can help us go through the things we struggle day by day? And I think the Bible offers a lot of help and insight in things like this. For instance, it points out that in the beginning that God created the world good. And so this struggles and pains that we see was not of his doing and not part of his plan. So we can have trust that there is a good God. And the biblical story then is the reason that there is a struggle is because of sin. You might want to say, but yeah, that was Adam and Eve's type of thing. That's not me, and there's further questions about that. But I think we can still grasp the fact that people do suffer because of someone else's choices. If you've sadly known of, and I hope not personally, it's just to say these are horrible things. People have had abusive parents, and the children suffer of no fault of their own. And so you could say the same thing. That doesn't seem fair, but sometimes that is part of life. And this is part of the story of saying evil has entered in, and it's not necessarily your or my doing, but it's humanity's in general, or at very least you're going to say it's the serpent, the devil, that's also brought these things in. And from that, there is a time when I would never want to say this of anyone, other than when I'm going through things, just to search my own life and say, is there something that I'm not doing quite right, that maybe God's sort of disciplining me or trying to nudge me in the right direction? Which is to say, our sins are serious things that we need to sort of look at as well. And I'm really not trying to say that about anyone, but it's just perhaps for a self-reflection at times to reflect on. And I think we'll see that it's definitely not in the biblical picture always the case that you're going through difficulties because of what you've done wrong. But there is perhaps a time for that. Another point is to see sort of in the big picture. It says in the end, in say the book of Revelation, that God will wipe away every tear from their eyes, that there will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. And so the picture is that one day he will set things right, that justice will be set. And so while we go through struggles and stuff now, that's not the sort of eternal picture that Christians paint. So it wasn't like that in the beginning. It wasn't something caused by God. It's through our sin, and it's something he's going to set right. And in the interim, if you like, it's not like God has been immune from this, or he hasn't cared to do anything about it. You read in places like Romans chapter 5, verse 8, says that, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And this is to say that in some viewpoints, it's like God creates the world, steps back, has nothing to do with it. But in the Christian story, he's been involved sort of every step of the way, and so much to the extent where he himself would come as the creator to be sort of insulted and abused by his creation. And he doesn't then say, I've given you like 1,000 chances, enough is enough, I'm just going to burn the whole thing up. It's saying like, he loves us that much that he would die in our place, such that we ultimately don't have to be facing a existence of ongoing sort of pain and suffering, but we can have a restored relationship to not only himself, but to others as well for all eternity. And that's the sort of hope. And just to read a passage here to perhaps give you a different perspective on seeing the cross. This is taken from a combination of Johnny Erickson Tada's book, When God Weeps, as well as John Stott. I'm just combining them. Sorry, just my pages are not in the best order. Yep. So it says, the perfect God who for all eternity enjoyed the love between the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. The God who alone is all-powerful, all-loving, all-knowing, holy, infinite, glorious, and righteous, full of grace and truth, who created angels and who ceaselessly cry out in worship to him, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, and proclaim that there is none like him. This God personally came to earth, and for what? Hear the story of the cross, as if for the first time. The face that Moses had begged to see, he was forbidden to see. That face was slapped bloody. The thorns that God had sent to curse the earth's rebellion were now twisted around his brow. On your back with you, one raises a mallet to sink in the spike, but the soldier's heart must continue pumping as he readies the prisoner's wrist. Someone must sustain the soldier's life, minute by minute, for no man has the power on his own. Who supplies breath to his lungs? Who gives his energy to his cells? Who holds his molecules together? Only by the Son do all things hold together. The victim wills that the soldier live, and he grants on the warrior continued existence. The man swings. As the man swings, the son recalls how he and the father first designed the nerve of the human forearm, the sensations it would be capable of. The design proves flawless. The nerves perform exquisitely. Up you go. They lift up the cross. God is on display, naked, and he can scarcely breathe. And these are merely the physical pains. How can we begin to describe the spiritual agonies that Jesus went through in bearing our sin? The filth of each one of us: liars, fornicators, gossips, terrorists, rapists, thieves, blasphemers. We who disobey our children, we who disobey our parents, we who abort our children, who oppress the poor, who drunkenly hit our wives, who destroy our bodies with drugs, who molest, who practice torture on animals. All the while, fully knowing God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve death. And we not only do them, but we approve of those who practice them. We cannot imagine the spiritual anguish that Jesus went through, that he would cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Yeah, and not to be accusation, but just in that sort of the cross of Christ, we see God himself as the creator sort of being willing to enter in and to bear the worst of it for us. But that's not sort of the only things that the Bible sort of has to offer. It points out that each step of the way that God is with us. He's I've just forgotten the term, but he's God with us, Emmanuel. There we go. Sorry, and the idea is that he even has gone through temptations and suffers and is able to help us along the way, and that we don't need to walk alone. The Bible also points out then that in terms of this problem of evil and suffering, you could say that he could do away with it. He could judge us right now, but he's patiently waiting for more people to repent and to turn from the wicked they do, that they too might be able to enjoy a good life forevermore. And beyond that, it's not just that you're left alone, but there is this body of Christ, the church, that should be helping bring love and kindness to the world. Philip Yancey, in his book, Whereas God When It's Hurt, was once approached by someone when he was talking and said, I don't really have time to read your whole book. Can you give me just a summary of it? And he very graciously said, where is the church? And I do know in a place like Australia, it's something like 15 of the 20 biggest charities are Christian charities that still there's much more that can be done, but are trying to show the love of Christ to people in need as well. Another point, and sorry if some of these just seem skirting all over the place, but the Bible taught us about when we struggle with pain and suffering, is in Luke chapter 13. It says, Now there were some present at that time who told Jesus about the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. Jesus answered, Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered this way? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you too will perish. And so this is to say that it's not just you're suffering because you've done something wrong sort of thing. It's really saying that to some degree we're all not at God's standard, and we need to sort of ask in an appropriate place, where are we in lines with that? Another big point that can be made is in John chapter 9. It reads, And as he went along, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus, but this happened so that the work of God might be displayed in his life. And so this is just one of the passages that you'll see that he's an innocent sufferer. Jesus is not saying he sinned or his parents. He's saying it's effectively that sometimes bad things can happen to good people of no fault of their own in that. And another passage in the Bible that has this same point is in the book of Job. And just to sort of summarize it, in the story we've got here that Job's said to be a righteous man. He's upright. And Satan comes along and is talking to God. And it's not that Satan says, hey, there's that guy Job, and you just really spoil him, and no wonder he loves you. Rather, it's God who brings him up. And God brings up Job because he's a righteous individual. So in that sense, Job suffers because he's good, not because he's wicked. And then, as part of this cosmic battle, God says, fine, go take away his family, his possessions, and we'll see what happens. And so Satan's given permission to do just that, and still Job says, the Lord gives and takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. And then Satan comes back again in chapter 2 and says, at the end of the day, people just care about themselves. So, if he's still all right, he's not going to, reject you. But if you strike out your hand and take away his health personally, then you see what happens. And so God allows Satan to go do that. And now we still see he holds on to his faith. And then sort of in the rest of the book, you basically have Job's first, it's really 4 friends, but only 3 of them are speaking for most of the book, who come and say, look, you must have done something wrong, confess it, and then things will be set right. But if you were really righteous, you wouldn't be going through these things. And there's that sort of like theology, if you like, sort of karma. And Job continues to say, no, I'm innocent. I want some time with God in the courtroom, and I'm going to, show that he's guilty, and he's unjustly allowing this stuff to happen to me. And so at the end of the book, he basically gets his wish. He gets time before God. And so God sort of speaks up and says, sort of, where were you when I created the world? Do you understand how the stars and the animals and all these things work? If you do, you tell me. And something that might seem a bit sort of harsh in some ways, but I take it, how I understand this is the point, is God's really saying to Job, do you know all these great things? Do you understand them? And it's not that a God is saying, you're a finite individual who just couldn't understand. I'd want to say that God is such a great teacher that he could even help small-minded people like myself understand these great things. But rather, God's saying that even if I don't tell you the why, I'm telling you who. Who am I as God? I'm a God who knows all these things, and you can trust me, even if you haven't been given this why of reason. In that sense, Job, unless you think he wrote the book, wasn't told sort of this bigger picture of what happened. And so here's a case of an innocent sufferer. And so it's likewise, I'd want to say, if you are going through difficulties, you don't need to say, it's because I've done such and such. It can be that we just live in a fallen world and that you're suffering, from no fault of your own. And I guess another big advice, which I've definitely not followed in that sense in this talk, is the best advice sort of Job's friends give to Job is in the first few verses of their presence, in which it says they sat with him for about a week and just kept their mouths shut. So it's just that comfort in the presence of a friend, rather than be trying to give out apparent words of wisdom. And that's, so I apologize, just, the nature of this topic. Obviously, you wouldn't want me to stand up here for 7 days with my mouth shut. But I think very much when we go through things, it's not always to look into these academic things and read some of these books. I think it really does help beforehand to know some of this sort of thing. But when you're going through them, there's a different approach. There's different things that are needed to help comfort you through that. just to read a story in a couple things in closing. This is an article from People magazine entitled The Gift of Pain. Ashlyn Blocker never has a tummy ache or cries about a scraped knee. So that's the title, The Gift of Pain. It's just the title on my slide. But yeah. So this is a story of an individual from the US from about 10 years ago, although she is still alive today. So it says, how lucky can you get? That's what John and Tara Blocker figured when their 2-year-old baby daughter, Ashlyn, developed a diaper rash so terrible that it hurt to look at. Miraculously, here she was with an awful inflammation, and still this sweet child, who always slept through the night and never cried, was acting like nothing was wrong. It wasn't until a few months later, when Ashlyn's left eye became bloodshot, that Blockers began to worry. We gave her drops, but she wasn't getting any better, says Tara, homemaker. My mummy instincts just kept saying, something's not right. Sure enough, an ophthalmologist discovered a massive corneal abrasion, a condition normally so painful that even an adult would be howling, but not Ashlyn. After further testing, doctors eventually determined that she suffers from a condition called congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis, or CIPA. It's incurable, untreatable, and so rare that only 35 cases are known in the US. CIPA makes Ashlyn completely unable to sense pain or extreme temperatures, and thus utterly vulnerable to the wide range of injuries and infections. When people hear about it, they're like, isn't that a good thing? Ashlyn's father, John, 32, a telephone technician, says, just take a moment and think about it. Pain is there for a reason. Ashlyn, now 5, and so that was about 10 years ago, she has badly burned her hand by leaving it on the muffler of a gas-powered motor. She's had her fingers crushed in a door frame on one horrible occasion, and on another occasion she walked into the Blockers' home in rural Patterson and said, I can't get this dirt off my skin. It wasn't dirt, her father says, cringing at the memory. It was hundreds of fire-biting ants. Only recently she has begun to comprehend that she is different from her friends. I can't feel my boo-boo, she explains. Some doctors say CIPA sufferers may also experience emotional problems. Someone as fearless as a child with CIPA could grow up to make bad judgments and take harmful risks, such as reckless drug use, and in other extreme, being excessively cautious. And most days, Ashlyn could hardly appear more ordinary. She'll cry when she gets her feelings hurt, or a toy taken away, says John. And she can feel tickles and hugs and kisses, says Tara. She's got the best laugh in the world. For the moment, her parents hold on to the hope that this fearless girl with missing front teeth will still have a remarkable life. Still, if they had one wish for their daughter, it would be this. I would give anything, absolutely anything, says Tara, for Ashlyn to feel pain. And so I think you can make a similar analogy with sort of our conscience as well, and say the fact that we do be able to feel evil and suffering in this is to actually act as a preventative, that further damage won't come. And it's so sad we live in a world where these things can be abused, and there's things like torture that is done on this. But that's to say perhaps the design in the first place wasn't necessarily flawed. Yeah, thank you just for the time, being able to sort of outline some of this. And I do hope just in the questions there's more that can be covered. And it's, yeah, an issue that I was saying, I've, felt the force of this sort of challenge of, if God is said to be good and loving, why did this stuff happen? And as I've read, I think there's, good reasons to be able to trust in God and to be able to see that this, while raises questions, is not sort of a reason to dismiss that God exists or Christianity in general. And I think just beyond that logical thing, it can help you sort of in struggles that you go through, knowing that he does love us and he's there for us. And I just want to close with a song. I'll just play as a video that sort of, I think, is the kind of reflection that we have for the struggles that we face. So thank you for this, and I look forward to trying to help explore some of the questions you might raise afterwards.
I've had questions without answers. I've known sorrow, I have known pain. But there's one thing that I cling to. You are faithful, Jesus, you're true. When hope is lost, I call you Savior. When pain surrounds, I call you healer. When silence falls, you'll be the song within my heart. In the lone hour of my sorrow, through the darkest night of my soul, you surround me and sustain me, my defender forevermore. When hope is lost, I call you Savior. When pain surrounds, I call you healer. When silence falls, you'll be the song within my heart. And I will praise you, I will praise you. When the tears fall, still I will sing to you. I will praise you, Jesus, praise you. Through the suffering, still I will sing. When hope is lost, I call you Savior. When pain surrounds, I call you healer. When silence falls, you'll be the song within my heart. I will praise you, I will praise you. And when the tears fall, still I will sing to you. I will praise you, Jesus, praise you. Through the suffering, still I will sing to you. Always I sing to you. Jesus, I'll sing for you. When laughter fails to comfort, when my heart aches, Lord, are you there? When confusion is all around me, and the darkness is my closest friend, still I will praise you, Jesus, praise you.
Hello, let's welcome you back. Come grab your seat again, and we're going to start our Q&A section. of this evening. So I just want to invite David, and I'm going to invite Paul. Paul was our last speaker at our last Think lecture covering Has Science Killed God? And so he's going to join us up. I think it's always good to sort of have a couple of guys sort of chopping in, and I don't know if I'll be allowed to add anything tonight. Is that I don't want handballing happening. Yeah, so actually Paul is David's boss during the week, and they're both from the City Bible Forum, which is a great organisation doing a lot for city workers. So basically the ministry that you guys are involved in is strictly for CBD kind of workers. Is that right?
Yeah, so it's there's probably 100,000 people who come into the city each day to work, and that's between the two of us, 50,000 each. We're still working on it, but whoever's in the city is welcome to our activities, or who wants to come in. So we're advertising an event at lunchtime today, just outside Trinity Church, and handing out flyers. And the best conversation that I had was with a lady who'd come in to do her shopping, and was asking about this topic. She said, "So why do you believe in God?" And I gave a couple of my reasons. I said I couldn't prove it, but I could give evidence. And then she said, "Well, on the other side of the coin, isn't there the amount of evil and suffering there is in the world? Surely that tips the balance towards there not being a God." So this question of the probabilistic argument against God's existence from evil was alive and well on the streets of Perth today. And so anyone who comes into the city is welcome to come on in. She kept on going for her shopping. She didn't come into City Bible Forum, unfortunately. Yeah.
Hey, yeah, it's a big topic, isn't it? I had someone the other day ask me, what is the biggest sort of issues, that we as Christians face engaging with the world around us, and I'd say that this would have to be one of the biggest, is the problem of evil. That if you worship an all-loving, all good God, then what do you do with that in regards to just stuff happening in this world? People dying. There was an earthquake in Ecuador where I think it was like 700 people just perished. And so how do we navigate through that as Christians? So I want to start with a question that actually I had. So I'm going to be cheeky because I've got the microphone, so I can. And it was a question that a few people sort of were talking to me during the break. So I think this is a great question because it sort of lays a foundation on the difference between permitting and then actually acting. So explain the difference between God permitting evil to occur and then him executing evil acts on his created creatures. So what I'm thinking is like the example of Job and Satan, God permitting Satan to do acts of evil upon Job. What is the difference between that and then, say, God actually committing those evil acts on his human creatures? And if there is a difference, then does that really matter or not?
Yeah, I feel you did sort of describe that well, in the sense that, you would say if God permits, if he allows Satan to do it, like in the sense that Satan says, hey, I want to take away his possessions, his health, or his family, and then God says, and you still might say, how can he allow that? But he does allow that, so Satan's the one who's ultimately guilty, and then you might say, but why would he allow that? Why can't he stop that? But I mean, the difference would be if God went and did it and said, don't worry, Satan, I got this covered. I'll squash his house, wipe out these other things and so it still would raise a lot of questions, but that's at least the difference. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, and I feel that it is an important point to make, that there's a difference between allowing evil to happen and actually being the agent of evil. Yes, and that God doesn't desire people to perish. It's not his perfect will, but he might have good reasons for allowing that to happen. So I guess we can kind of recognize that in our own experience, that there'll be some things which we do that we're culpable for. Some of our actions we're culpable for, we're guilty for. And sometimes our omissions can be culpable, but not always. So I know of suffering in the world, and there's things that I could do to stop them, but I'm not necessarily culpable for not doing every single one. So I might have a good reason for not giving my last dollar to a charity, although giving to the charity, that would be a good thing to do with my last dollar. I might have a good reason for not doing that.
Yep, absolutely. Any more to add?
I guess one other thing, just to clarify, so it also depends sort of where this question's coming from, in the sense that if it's a logical challenge, I could just say, well, there is this difference, and I don't know why God might permit Satan to do such horrible things. But for the logical problem, I don't need to be able to give an actual reason. But if I can just say, well, as long as he's not directly doing it, Satan doing it, well, then that's not him causing the evil, so it's compatible. And you may say, at the end of the day, I don't care about that. I want to know an actual reason. And to some degree, I might say, I just really don't know. But in terms of, say, disproving God, then doesn't go on to show it. And I guess that it's just a different answer than you can give and say, I don't know, I'm happy to be your friend, stand by you. And as we're saying, that's what God has done in Jesus coming.
Absolutely. Okay, next question. How much evil do you believe is directly caused by the enemy? So I'm assuming this means Satan. And the second part of the question is, how much of a leash is Satan on? In brackets. I know it's impossible to answer, but maybe some insight there.
Yep. And so this is another one where, in terms of that sort of logical response, I'm just saying, I honestly don't know. And unless you've got a word from God, and I'm not trying to say that like flippantly, but I'm saying, yeah, I mean, if there's prophets, when in the Old Testament, particularly in even New Testament times, they'll say, this is what's sort of happening and why. But unless you've got that, we just really don't know. And I can think, sadly, of modern events, such as the 2004 tsunami near Indonesia. I was hearing news articles of people saying, this is God's, and I'm not saying by any means this is correct. I'm just saying I've read news articles that said such things, that said, this is God's judgment on pagan nations, kind of thing. And the flip side is my mother's from Singapore, my wife as well, and I was in Singapore near that time. And I do distinctly remember a pastor, who I'm going to leave nameless, who said the exact opposite and said, this is the work of the devil, he's bringing this as well. And so I'd partly want to say, with most of this stuff, unless you've got some sort of insight, we don't know. And you've got to be honestly asking, like, am I, are all these people fully innocent, and that God couldn't be judging and disciplining at times? Or, we do trust that God is good. He's not directly causing or doing evil. So, this could be the devil. I know that's just not a very helpful, practical distinction, but I just feel that's sort of where we end up being placed.
I guess there's a lot about the devil that we don't know, and it's better for us to admit our ignorance there than say that he's limited. But I guess the main point that the Bible makes is that Satan's instrument is deceit. And I guess through the story of the Bible, from beginning to end, he's there as the deceiver. So he deceives Eve with half-truths and leads her astray. And when Jesus comes to speak about him, he says he's the father of lies. He's been lying from the beginning. And so I think that would be his the main way that he works in the world is to deceive humans who commit evil, who exercise their will in a way that's contrary to God's. So how much of a leash is he on? I mean, the Job one's a good example, because there he doesn't seem to be exercising deceit. He might have deceived the Chaldean raiders who came and stole Job's cattle, but he also seems to be able to do more than that in Job's story. A whirlwind is what knocks down the house that kills his children. So I'm not saying that Satan can only do this, but the Bible says don't have a passion for the truth and watch out for lies, because you're going to be held to account for your actions, and the truth will really shape those. In terms of the leash that he's on, the picture of the Bible from beginning to end is that despite Satan's rebellion against God and his the turmoil that he's unleashed on the world, God is still in control, and in the end, Satan will be robbed of his power and shut away. I don't want to give away the end of the story, but good wins in the end, and Satan doesn't. And in the meantime, it's particularly the power of half-truths that we need to watch out for. There's an amazing scene at the end of The Lord of the Rings, if you're into that, where not Sauron, he's the big guy, isn't he, with the eye? The other one, Sauron. Have I got this the right way around? Apologies. Yeah, Sauron has been robbed of his power. He's no longer able to affect things physically, but the heroes have to look out for him, because when they speak to him, you can almost smell the sulfur, just the half-truths that are coming through. And I think that is Satan's main effect in our experience and in our culture. It's those half-truths that play on our desires and lead us away from God's will.
Well, let's stick with Satan for a sec. So if we say that it's possible that natural evil has something to do with his work, if he is the prince of this world, then this question, which is an interesting question, is if an earthquake happens and no one is hurt, is that still inherently evil?
Yep. So yeah, in terms of natural evil, so there's times, as Paul just mentioned in the book of Job, where Satan is said to stand behind a whirlwind, and I'm not sure of any other cases, but likewise, in cases say as Noah's flood, it's not in some sense directly stated that was God. For instance, he could have permitted Satan to do that. It doesn't say that he permitted Satan to do that, but you could just argue that it hasn't directly specified. So with a lot of these, you won't be able to necessarily know. And so in the sense of if someone who's committed a crime, say murder, got sentenced to a prison sentence or capital punishment, depending on where you live, the government might see that as a just situation. Like, what's done to that individual is a just thing. They're getting what they've deserved. Although it's possible, and assuming the person is actually guilty, they might still say, hey, this is an evil. Why am I getting punished? And I'm not trying to say they're saying because I don't only deserve a week, not a year or something. They could just say, hey, this is an evil done to me. So an actual event is sometimes a little bit ambiguous. Sort of a earthquake happens and people are suffering, to say that, obviously if they're innocent, then that's like an evil being done. But, if it's in disciplinary, say like a Noah's flood, was that an evil being done to them or something like this? And in terms of just the whole of morality and evil, you'd want to say, yeah, it's not just the consequences, the effects that, like, if someone suffers from this, there's just, like, a lie is bad even if no one gets hurt from it. And if you're into virtue ethics, if you give the analogy of someone being mugged and someone being a mugger, you could ask, where's the greatest evil being done? And you might think it's obviously the person who was mugged. They've had their freedom taken away from them, possessions, they've been scared and stuff like this. But a virtue ethicist would say, no, the greatest evil that happened was to the mugger, and he did it to himself. In the act of mugging someone, he's done something to his character and his very being that's even as horrible as the crime he committed is worse to himself. And so likewise, I'm just saying, so with this earthquake, natural evil disaster sort of thing, even doesn't affect anyone, you'd still want to say if it's an evil act kind of thing, doing damage to the earth, because you could say there's other moral agents like animals or something. That's also sort of relevant to this equation, depending on how you understand morality and evil and stuff. And likewise, too many strange comments here, but people have commented that as bad as things like the tsunami was for humans, this was technically a big boost for fish life. They got more areas to swim, more food, and stuff like this. So, depending on I'm not saying everything's subjective, relative type of thing, but I'm just saying depending on how you look at the scenario, you could say some good is brought about in some of these things. So it's just big questions, and I probably didn't answer any of them.
And the Bible's full of examples of good coming from suffering, good even coming from God allowing people to make evil choices. So at the end of Genesis, we find out that Joseph's brothers have sold him into slavery in Egypt, and they've done that because they were jealous and spiteful, and they had evil intent. But God allowed it to bring about the saving of many lives. You know, those brothers' lives were saved by Joseph going down to Egypt and storing up grain to feed them and the whole population of Egypt, but also other nations. So in that moral sphere, we see examples of God allowing evil choices for good purposes. And I guess the story of the Bible is the movement from a good creation to the perfection of creation. And for me, my perspective, although I recognize that different Christians have different opinions on this, my perspective is that tectonic plates rubbing against each other is part of this process of God moving from a good creation, which was empty and void, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the deep, to a progressed creation where mankind was tending over a garden. But that's not the end point. The end point is mankind living with God in a city where not only do we owe him our lives because he's made us, but we also owe him our lives because he has died for us. So I'd look at examples of natural disaster, not just from that end point, the utilitarian kind of is there a net advantage or not, but also recognizing that God can even use those things in his plan. And of course, as David said, the chief example of God bringing good out of evil is Jesus' death. Pilate washed his hands for the sake of political convenience and fear. The Jewish leaders executed him, or wanted him executed because of jealousy. Judas betrayed him over money, it would seem, or at least that was the spark that set things alight for him. But God did it because he wanted to show just how much he loves sinners and wanted us to be with him despite all the harm that we'd caused.
Yeah, that's great. I've heard it said that sort of those tectonic plates is a part of a necessity element of providing a life-giving world. So there's certain attributes of our world and the universe around us that need to be there. And if they're not there, we have no life. And so it's interesting.
Yeah, I think the more we understand tectonic plates and subduction, the more we just go, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
How did God come? Well, for me, I look at it as a theist and go, how did God come up with this? And I don't know whether it's necessary. I don't have the wisdom to say that, but it's certainly amazing.
I have no idea.
Yeah.
I read it from someone who knew.
Yeah. That's a good way to go.
Yeah. So we've touched on a couple of times. You've used the example of the tsunami in Southeast Asia, and I've got a question here about this whole problem of the problem of pain and suffering. Is it necessarily a problem for all cultures around the world, or is this in particularly a Western problem in regards to them understanding who God is? Is this more of a barrier for your average Western person? I know you've done some work in apologetics in Southeast Asia. Is it necessarily a big issue for, say, the non-theist, the unbeliever, in that sort of region of the world?
Yeah, so I definitely wouldn't say it is a question. I think that not like I've spoken or read about everyone, but yeah, everyone does struggle with. I do think some places raise it more than others, and I guess it's interesting that the question generally isn't raised as much in, say, developing countries who might have more reason to raise it as such. And there can be various reasons for that. Like, and I partly don't even want to get into it in a sense. It's almost pointing a finger at us and saying, hey, we're so comfortable, we complain about these things. And I don't want to say that, because we do go through real struggles and difficulties, and I'm not trying to make them less. But there is questions that can be thought about like that. But also, I guess it's part of the cultural worldview, which is to say, so most Western countries have had a fairly large influence from Christianity, in which they expect and believe it to be an all-powerful, all-good God. But in many parts of Asia, things like Taoism is a popular belief there, and that's more of a dualistic worldview, where there eternally is both good and evil, and so you would expect there to always be evil was there in the beginning, it will continue to be there forever forth, type of thing. Or in both Buddhism and Hinduism, you've got more the idea that this whole of reality is itself a bad thing. And the idea is you're wanting to escape reality and become sort of either reach nirvana, a place of ceasing of nothingness in Buddhism, or be sort of back with Brahman in Hinduism and just cease to be a personal entity. But the whole of this reality is technically an illusion and is just sort of a bad thing. And you don't raise the same sort of question. You don't have this personal God who could cause or stop sort of things as well. And there's an expectation that just to be in this is, in a sense, it's part of the show. So I don't know if that helps a bit.
I want to expand on what David said there in terms of Buddhism and Hinduism, and particularly the idea of karma, that as I understand it, there's probably as many conceptions of karma as there are Hindus and Buddhists in the world, but as I understand from the traditions and from some friends who've been Buddhists, the idea in karma is that there is unavoidable law to reincarnation into the cycles of the universe, which means that if someone is born in a particular station and place, it would be a wrong thing to do. You'd be going against karma, against this law, to interfere in that situation. So if you saw a beggar on the street, he's there because of karma. Everything's there because of karma. He's there because of something that he's done wrong in this life or in a previous life, and it would actually be a immoral, a wrong thing to interfere with that, because that's the law of nature working its way through. So at that point, it's quite a different proposition to Christianity, where suffering can be a natural effect which it's wrong to interfere in. You don't want to wish it away. That's just you holding to this illusion of your experience and wanting to, or being stuck in the cycle. You're part of the problem if you interfere. So that would be one thing that I'd say, that this is a question that's more appropriate in Christianity, where you believe in an all-good God and your hope is in a world where there will be no suffering. I think it's also, I'd probably want to build on what David said, in that it's where we live in a suffering adverse culture, where we try to minimize pain in our experience of it in every aspect of life. And in previous generations, the more trivial things of stubbing a toe or losing a finger would not have been thought of as necessarily that bad. It's part of the process of life and growth. And certainly most of the world feels acutely the existence of evil and that it's a real problem. So people who have lived through the Holocaust would equally say, or many would say, how can you not believe in God after the Holocaust, rather than how can you believe in God after the Holocaust? Because they feel so strongly that there is such a thing as objective evil. It's not just my preference, it really is evil. And certainly through most of human history, people have suffered more than we do now. and have said this suffering is real, this is really wrong, and we really believe an objective solution should come. So I think that we do live in a fairly sterilized world. Not to say that we don't experience real suffering, but we have a particular aversion to it. So I think that at least contributes to this being the number one objection to Christian faith.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a couple of questions here that probably can tie into each other, and I guess the overarching question is, should we believe that the fall was a part of God's plan for humanity? Couldn't we have had relationship with Him without the fall? And I guess this other question goes into that second question a lot more in regards to life goes on. God knows everything about me, knows my thoughts, my actions. Why doesn't He just go directly to the end with us? Why do we have to go through this life? Yeah, so just leave it at that. Go for it.
Really great questions. Traditional Christians are definitely going to affirm that God is all-knowing, He's omniscient, and so yes, He would have known had He created an Adam and Eve and placed them in a garden, what would have happened, that they would fall, kind of thing. So He had to have had His reasons for permitting and allowing that. Because you could say, yeah, if He didn't like that, instead of creating an Adam, He could have created someone else, or instead of He just didn't like that scenario, He could have done something about that. So you would want to say He knows that. Yeah, and in terms of then sort of why, I'm not sure if there's a direct answer that you'd want to say. I mean, some of it might be to develop character and sort of grow, but you could also equally say pilots can learn to fly on the simulators, at least to a certain standard. Like, did we have to have real objective evil like this to grow, and stuff like that can be asked. The same parallel sort of question could be even asked about, for instance, the angels and demons sort of thing. In what state were they sort of made? And while we don't know all the details by any means, if you think passages like Isaiah chapter 14 or Ezekiel 28 are talking about this, it would seem to indicate that all the spiritual beings were made good, but then one of them, the devil, Satan, Lucifer, chose to, for whatever reason, reject sort of God, pride or something, and some of the other angels chose to follow and turn as well. And spiritual beings are spiritual, so we're not thinking of them existing in a material realm as such. But the question would still be, like, in sort of what did they know of God? What sort of relationship did they have? And they know that they chose to turn from, and it doesn't seem to be that they've been given a second chance. Unlike humans, we do have, Jesus died for us, and we can have a second chance, and stuff like this. People have also asked in just this question, is some of the issues, what happens to people who die either before an age of accountability or in the womb itself, sort of thing? What happens to those sort of scenarios? And if you want to say that they go to heaven, then these people are not having growth and having to go through stuff. They just get to go straight to heaven. So why couldn't it have that been like all of us and stuff? And so there's big questions, and there's stuff that has been offered in this. I can think of a philosopher, Alexander Pruss, who's suggested about there'll be different experiences of heaven for people who are in that state and stuff like this. And so if you're interested, you can look into that. But great question. I think we don't have all the answers, but we would want to affirm very much that God did know what was going to happen, and He's got His reasons for permitting and allowing things like that.
Is it in Revelation there's that phrase that the Lamb of God was crucified from the creation of the world? And I think God has a plan. He had a plan that His Son would be crucified, that He would display His goodness, His love, by entering into sinners experience and suffering at their hands. And at the end of this story, not only are we going to be perfected beings or perfect beings living in God's presence, which I guess the question is saying, why didn't he just go straight there? We will also be redeemed beings who God himself has died for. And that is an expression of God's character. We will know more of God as our Saviour and our Maker than we would just as our Maker.
And there's a beautiful point of view that you can really switch on in that problem, in that how beautiful an act for him to continue out with creation, knowing that we would rebel, knowing that we would turn away, that we would that there would be a coup against the king, to go about and do our own thing. And even in that he creates, even in that he knows that his son would need to be sacrificed for the redemption of his created people. Yeah, unbelievable.
Add that comes to mind if you're an Alvin Plantinga fan, which I've been kept mentioning him. He has an article called Supralapsarianum o Felix Culpra, this Latin phrase which I probably butchered, and it's O Happy Fall, and this is a viewpoint amongst Christians that God wanted the fall for particular ends and reasons, and if you're interested, you can look into that.
Very good.
Can I just add something to that?
You can.
It makes me think of the scene in Les Mis where the criminal has stolen the candelabras, and is caught and brought back to the priest, and he says, "Oh, you only took the candlesticks, you forgot to take this as well." And he was just completely overcome by the kindness of that man. A kindness that he'd experienced in his hospitality, but then a kindness that he experienced in mercy, being given in grace, given something that he completely did not deserve. And that, of course, is our experience of Christians, that we're all culpable, we've all been involved in evil, and pardoned in a way that we definitely didn't deserve.
Okay, so this sort of brings up this question. If God isn't in the business of taking away our pain and suffering now, then what is he up to? What's more important to God than our suffering?
Okay, so I'm not going to pretend to know all the answers, but a question that I found helpful is, if I were God, obviously I'd end all the pain, but if I were God, the question came
Probably
back
create
to
some
me.
more.
Yeah, exactly. That would be a disaster. How would I end all the pain? And I guess I would stop evildoers from doing evil. And if I was just, then I would hold them to account for the evil that they have done. And that is God's plan. And in 2 Peter chapter 3, he says that he's delaying his judgment. He's delaying his vindication. Everyone will see that God is just and merciful in the end. They'll see that demonstrated when Jesus returns. But he's delaying that day when people will no longer be able to speak slanderously about his character, because he loves those people who are slandering him. And I'm certainly glad that God delayed his judgment until after 2006, when he finally brought me to repentance. Because certainly up to that point, I'd been slandering his character and didn't think that the Christian God could possibly be good. But the world continued to suffer and to call for justice for long enough for me to be brought back to him.
So what you're saying is he's more interested in our sin and the redemption of us,
Yeah, he's more
as
interested in our
opposed
forgiveness.
to our pain and suffering.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I would much rather a life with God for eternity than a life without suffering without him.
Yeah, well put. All good? Okay, so how do we engage with someone going through pain and suffering? And how would it be different to someone who is not experiencing a hardship or pain or suffering presently? So what would be the difference in your approach, your apologetics? How would you approach someone that is actually being or going through enduring pain and suffering now in your apologetics?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I do think it would be very different. So I wouldn't recommend necessarily mentioning any of the stuff I've said. Like, why did I say any of it then? Yeah. So I think this would be stuff that if they've read beforehand or gone through, it would help, I believe, through the struggle. But if they've in an issue, to bring this up would basically make you into one of Job's tormenting friends. And so you would need to wait till they're ready to sort of approach it themselves. And that's to say they may well ask the question and say why. And I think unless you're just that close to them as a friend that you know that you can say something now, it's better to sort of say, I just really don't know. And I think in the reason they're going through, you probably wouldn't know. And so that'd be a real honest answer and just say, I'm so sorry, be a friend, pray for them, do what you can to help them. So yeah, it'd be very much like a counseling, pastoral sort of answer, not this sort of academic stuff that I've mentioned. But that's to say this does have a time and place. So 6 months later or something, depending what they're going through, they may be really asking, hey, I find it difficult at church now because I can't understand why God, let me go through that. And while there'd still be much emotional pain and hurt through it, it's at a little bit more of a distance. So I think they could also just think through what is the actual complaint here, between as an actual issue or just sort of struggling with. Yep.
Yeah, I agree with David that often the best thing we can do, almost always the best thing we can do, is to be quiet and to listen. A friend of mine had taught every one of those passages that David had up on the screen, and he knew them off by heart. And he was in hospital with gallbladder, so extreme pain. And he said if anyone had come in and quoted the Bible to him, he would have smacked them in the face. And I think the best thing that we can do as friends and with family members is to listen. And it's the place of the person who's suffering to voice a lot of these consolations. A friend of mine lost a child, and still every time he was asked how many kids do you have, he just felt agony to answer that question. But while I stayed with him, he shared that one thing that had come from it was that he felt that he understood God's loss better as a father who'd lost a child. And that was true, but it was his place to say it and not mine. And yeah, I do agree that it's good to know every reason the Bible offers and every piece of hope, not so we'll have all the answers, but so that we might have some consolation when we suffer, because it's coming. And I guess in my experience of suffering, personally, it's been Jesus' example as a shining light of suffering that God allowed for a very good purpose that has been a consolation to me in those times. And if someone were to ask, then I'd err on the side of silence, but I would say that God has suffered and God does care about your suffering.
I remember I read When God Weeps. Who's that by again? Sorry?
John Erickson Tada, and he's a husband. That's a different
Yep. Which is a great book, and I'd advise you to have a read of it. And she describes a story about speaking with a lady who she was reasonably good friends with, and whose son had grown up with a very horrible health condition, and then was informed that he was going to, something else happens with his health, and then that he was going to die within a year or so. And the mum is just complaining to God. She is going, we've been through so much since he was born, and we just, all we wanted was him to live a reasonably, long life. But now you're robbing that as well. You know nothing about the suffering that I'm going through. Do you even know what it's like to lose a son? And as soon as she said it, it says in the book, she covers her mouth and goes, "Oh my gosh, you know exactly what it's like to lose a son and the pain of a parent." So God is so intimately knowing, and the author herself was paralyzed, so she's a quadriplegic now. Back in 1987, I believe it was. I think it was a horse. Was it a horse riding accident? Yeah. And again, just her awareness that Christ was paralyzed on the cross for her, and that there's an experience of God's intimacy in our suffering. Go for it.
I guess also another temptation that I'd want to avoid is feeling that I need to defend God. And the Psalms are full of people complaining to God, and He's big enough to handle it.
Yes,
And
yes.
if
He is.
people in their suffering are calling out like that woman did, then it's our place to listen. And
Absolutely.
To know that
Yeah.
God's honour doesn't depend on us, and He's happy to listen to whatever our thoughts are.
All right. Well, I think we'll wrap up. But is there anything else that you guys have, burning points or last-minute thoughts that you want to sort of chuck in before we wrap up tonight?
Just some closing thoughts, but yeah, and thank you very much for having me. I do hope this has been useful, and I know there's so much more that can be said, and I'm just really scratching the surface, and hopefully not in a bad way. But thank you for listening, and yeah, I'd just sort of reiterate that I'm actually more from the philosophical slant on the problem of evil, and in my readings of it, I found that Christians do really have some good answers in this. In fact, Alvin Plantinga's work, which was published in about the 70s, I think 1974 off the top of my head, by and large, it's been accepted by the majority of professional philosophers that he's given an acceptable answer to the logical problem of evil, such that in the literature nowadays, it's not raised as much of a challenge. It still is and stuff, and actually there's been sort of updates to his model and people have defended different ways, but yeah, that's a significant thing as such. And beyond that, I think as a problem of evil, it is something that you'd struggle with, and I do hope you've got just friends or people like this church who I would sort of be honoured to be able to just stand by, not necessarily to give answers, but to be there with you and to strugglings. And so I would hate for anyone who is hurting to feel alone and to feel sort of hopeless. And I'd very much encourage you to have a friend that you can share with, approach the church, and they'll try to just be there for you. So yeah, thank you very much for having me.
I've said, so I'll repeat, that I think the most likely reason for me to, if I ever were to stop being a Christian, it would be on this question of, or my experience of suffering. I want to recant that. I think probably it would be my hardness of heart that would really be the reason. But it is a problem. It's the number one objection to Christianity. And the reason why many of my close friends aren't Christians, the reason that they would give. Having said that, the most likely reason for me to leave Christianity would be the goodness of God and the experience of suffering. It's also been a big pull away from atheism or away from materialism, because it really is lacking there of giving an account of our experience of suffering, and can't offer, I haven't seen it offer an account of objective evil, real evil, absolute. And so for me, there's two sides to that coin. That if suffering were a reason to give up on God, it's as big a reason to not give up on Him. But I would want to say that Christianity does stand out in terms of the worldviews. If a worldview offers a story of everything from beginning to end, then the story of Christianity is if not a theodicy, a defense of God in the face of evil, it's a theoodyssey, which is the story of God and His interactions with evil. And so the story from beginning to end of the Bible is the defeat of evil through the suffering of God. And for me, that's the most compelling story of life in this world that I've seen so far.